Webinar today. This is going to be on why point solutions for RevOps is dead and the future of solutions are horizontal. And I'm really excited to be joined by Lisa Kelly, VP of Revenue Operations over at Canto. And I am James MacArthur. I am the Director of RevOps, Partnerships, and Community here at New. If you want to connect with Lisa, here is her LinkedIn right here. And you'll see it is popped up in the chat. And then mine is right here. So feel free to connect with us. We can talk. We're happy to talk RevOps anytime and always open to the conversation like we're going to have today. So Lisa, really excited for this. Just want to jump right in. So just tell me a little bit about, like, what do we mean when we say that point solutions are dead?
Well, I think if you go back several years, the software world was exploding, right? There was all these different point solutions to solve a specific problem, right? I have a problem, I'm going to purchase a tool to fix it. And then you end up with this huge proliferation of tools where you've got, a list a mile long of all the things in your tech stack, because in a growing SaaS organization, problems arise. And so if you buy a point solution every time a problem arises, you end up with a lot of different point solutions. So I think, it's super important to be thinking about your whole go-to-market process. And I mean, when you look at the evolution of, sales operations into sales, marketing, and service operations into revenue operations, and looking at the thing, we've finally figured out that you have to respect the full revenue lifecycle. You can't just be like, hey, this solves this little problem in a box, and not actually think about what happens before and after. So I think looking at the handoff points and the downstream and upstream implications, and where you're going as a company is something that was really neglected in these early stage point solution purchases. And now we've recognized that is a problem in and of itself. So you really do have to have data that tracks from the front part, the first experience of that customer, all the way through to when they're ready for renewal. You've got to be able to track the entire customer journey, and having a point solution like, hey, I can get this information from this little one box, is why, a lot of us end up living in spreadsheets to try and pull information together that isn't connected. So,
yeah.
You can't have your CFO hate your CPQ, because that's what they base their entire revenue lifecycle on. So I think that's something that, you've got to be considering that. But, I'm going to put it back on you, James. Like, what are some of the consequences of not relying on point solutions heavily?
Yeah, so, relying too heavily on point solutions it's a symptom of silo syndrome, which is a thing that I've been talking about a lot over the years, and it's a hallmark of Go Nimbly, which is where I actually started my RevOps career. And the idea behind silo syndrome is exactly what you were talking about, which is new marketing leader joins and says, hey, I really want this tool that's going to do heat mapping on our website. Oh, I really want this tool that does this one thing. And the CS leader says, oh, I want to track this one data point, and only this tool can do it. And all of a sudden, you're looking at 30, 40, 50 different tools, which are loosely stitched together. And so whenever I see a stack and I see that they've got 20, 30, 40 different tools at a mid-size, chances are you've also got some internal politics that are a little nuts, and an org structure that is not enabling you to think about your customer journey in one holistic manner. So it's, for me, there are a lot of underlying problems that lead to this, and it's something that I think is really indicative of a lot deeper issues. So, like, what are some of the ways in the past that you've seen companies try to, in the early stages, combat this?
Well, I mean, you talking about early stages of growth or early stages of their tech stack proliferating?
Tech stack proliferation, not necessarily growth, because as we all know, this doesn't necessarily start until you start going, I need a professional VP of sales, and that professional VP of sales has, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think of it a lot of times it happens. I'll talk a little bit about like what I've seen from, especially on the consulting side. When I was working there, I saw a lot of companies that had had this huge point solution proliferation. But what I say is a lot of times heads of sales, heads of marketing, heads of CS will come in with their favorite pet tools that worked for them in their previous companies, and I view it as a really important part of revenue operations to help control that and say, hey, we have similar functionality. However, this tool will allow us to get a better visual for the other departments, right? It's not just for you, it's for everybody to use. And I think that you start to see a lot of disparate information flowing around. Well, we had this many leads. No, we had this many leads. And we closed this many dollars, and that is recognizable here. And I think that there's a lot of challenges there. But early mitigation usually looks like, trying to just do that assessment of looking at the tech stack and saying, who's using it? Why are they using it? What is the business case behind it? And the other part that really happens rarely, and in fact, I was on a great roundtable today where we were talking about the fact that like very few companies circle back and say, did we get the ROI that was sold to us? Right? Did we actually get this benefit out of it? What happens is leadership changes, the processes evolve, and it gets put on the shelf, and then it's your CFO's worst nightmare. And so oftentimes if you just start asking questions about usage, checking last logins, what teams are using it, and actually looking at it from a departmental perspective of saying, who's using this information? What are and I've even gone so far as to draw like an actual process map to say this information feeds into these systems and this is where they're interconnected, and clear definitions of data. That's also a really important point. But I think when you get this tech stack proliferation, you've got to do something about it, and doing something early and then drawing the line and saying, we're not going to add to our tech stack until we know that nothing in our tech stack provides that functionality, because a lot of times there's underutilized tech in a tech stack as well. So yeah.
That's an awesome point, and it actually makes me circle back to the question you just asked me, which is what are the consequences around not relying on point solutions too heavily, which is that where you end up with broken data models, broken customer life cycles, broken journeys. And it's so the early mitigation pieces are actually the starting point that leaders can use to reference as they're thinking about, okay, how am I going to build my org? How am I going to build everything? Because what ends up happening is as you reach scale, all of a sudden you go, hey, what's our ARR? And literally no one in the organization can tell you.
Right. Well, and if you just want to take it from the front lines, on the front lines, what you deal with is tool fatigue, right? They have to use 15 different tools to just do their day-to-day job. So they have tool fatigue, right? I got to go in this system to do this and this system to do that, switch over to this tab or whatever it is. And I think that that's one of the things that, like, if you're talking about 3 or 4 things that they have to use, they're usually, people are really supportive of that. But if you're talking about, 15, 20 different things that they have to do, you end up with tool fatigue. And then as you go up the corporate ladder and you've got your middle management, you've got them people arguing over the truth, right? What is the truth? What is the reality? What is our actual fact, black and white? What is the correct data? And then you get into the boardroom and they're making business decisions on information that has been pulled together from so many disparate sources. And whether that be done in an Excel spreadsheet or for a more mature organization, a BI tool, I think it's still one of those things where you end up with a lot of different and conflicting information. So, yeah.
And so off the back of that, I have to ask you, like, what is an actual, because we're talking about point solutions, what is an actual horizontal solution?
Okay. Well, if you think about your entire customer life cycle, right? And you were to map like where the technology is used, the longer the line, the more of a horizontal platform it is. So, I mean, if you think about things like Salesforce is obviously a very horizontal platform. Sometimes people use it, they'll have something their lead environment might live elsewhere, but then it enters Salesforce at some point and the sales process will live there. And then you've got other things like, HubSpot can span. You've got things like Zendesk. Anaplan is another one that's a good example of a horizontal platform. Outreach is becoming increasingly horizontal. It spans beyond a single point in the customer journey. It serves a purpose beyond just that one point in time, that one use case, that one problem. It's going to truly be like if you mapped your process and then map the technology underneath it, it's going to be a horizontal line, not a dot. So I think that's an important nuance there. So yeah.
So encompassing the entire life cycle or an entire section of the life cycle where you're thinking about this is not just solving one problem for one team, but it's solving so many problems across the entire org.
Yes. Yeah. It's especially like those really precious horizontal tools are the ones that span in a handoff stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
From lead to opportunity to customer and then customer to renewal. Like those things that can span in that customer life cycle perspective are really the ones that are the precious gems. So yeah.
And that's so hard because that's often like when you go back and look at your customer lifecycle, that's where things fall down. That's where your
Mhm.
process falls down. Is anytime there's a handoff, that's where you're dropping people. So it makes a ton of sense that the horizontal are the pieces that are going to take care of that. So
Yeah.
then looking at that, so we've talked horizontal solutions. What are some examples of point solutions that you're seeing right now?
Things that only do one thing, like scheduling tools, attribution tools, social monitoring tools, CPQ. I print out a quote and that's all I do. I think that's, anything that has a single intention and doesn't actually go beyond that one thing that it does is a great example of a point solution. So, like I said, look for those horizontal lines, not the little dots on your process map.
Yeah. And I'd like to add, literally, because it's all I see, is any AI writing tool that exists right now. It feels like AI came out and everybody was like, let's build a bunch of point solutions connected to it.
Yep.
It's,
Yeah. Well, and I think it's like AI is intended to make point solutions deeper. And the
yeah,
thing is in my opinion, going deeper into one vertical problem is not the way to go. It's talking about that horizontal problem. Like if AI can help you span a gap or something like that, but I haven't seen that yet. Most of it's just like, hey, we plugged into it and this is where we are. But I think that'll come with time as we really figure out what we have with true AI and learning. So yeah.
yeah. Actually, our partners who were with this webinar on WizOps and Sonar, they actually just came out with their data dictionary, which is a really cool extension of AI. It's a great way to look horizontally across your stack. It's
See, and
actually pretty
that
cool.
see stuff like that, like where you're using AI to truly bring things together. That's so powerful. But I think that there's, if it's just a writing tool to say provide you with a prompt, it's, and I would say that you've got to get really really good at using an AI writing tool because it's not
Yeah,
hard to see usually. So um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think when you think about the point solutions, you know, why are they a problem? Like what is it that is inherent about them in addition to the fact that we saw they just like they don't consider the front or the back. What are some other things that you think about when it comes to that?
it's it's the problem is generally they're isolated. So it's I have to log into this app to do this one thing. I have to log into this app to do this email. That email maybe sometimes syncs to your system of record, which is generally Salesforce, sometimes HubSpot, but they're isolated. The data is not really going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's not coming in, sometimes it's not going out. It's hard to debug without an integration user, and it's hard to say I'm going to use 30 to 40 users in my Salesforce org. to
Yeah.
track every single data piece. And it's generally some of the loudest in the room because it was bought for a specific purpose. It's like the data from CPQ is almost always the loudest because it's your revenue
Yeah.
and
Oh,
it's your bookings.
yeah, I would say that that's probably one of the more powerful examples because if you think about it, a lot of them are, they generate a document, but that information is re-input to however many other systems manually. It's usually there's a human being that is looking at that and saying, okay, this is what implementation needs to know, this is what finance needs to know, and having that like complete isolation is just like, we talked about like integrations and how like you've got to bring your whole people together. That's a chasm. Like that is a dead end. And I mean, I've been in many organizations where it's just, we have a human being that takes that contract and looks at it, types it in, and you're counting on, human. Some of us are prone to errors occasionally, but I think that's a really dangerous thing, especially on a CPQ, because that is everything. That is that's where your data comes from. That tells your finance team how to model out cash, how to look at what our revenue looks like, our growth numbers, like all of that information. Being isolated is one of the most painful things out there. So
Yeah, and the other side of this is every connection point is that point of failure where
oh,
it's every single time you connect one system to another,
mm-hmm.
you run into a piece where it's maybe that data is not going to pass through. So if to extend the CPQ analogy, it's if your finance team then has to spend 20 minutes figuring out what's in an order because half the data transferred over,
Yeah. It's
that's
it's the reason why your CFO is not the happiest person. No.
it's
I
the
think
reason they continue
okay,
to buy
so
Excel when she. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I call that stitching, right? So the stitching
Yeah.
between different products, and whether that be, HubSpot into Salesforce or all the tools that go along the way. And every point of stitching, just like as in a piece of clothing, the point of stitching is the point of failure. And that's where things can often go wrong. Information can, break. API connections aren't always perfect. They can be, but I think that stitching is like in the case we just used, that's human stitching. That's like a human being holding two things together. And then there's technology when if you can have that like seamless experience between those two technologies, that's great. And as long as it's stable and everything good to go, that's what we do. I mean, if you have a Slack channel or you have a ticketing system as a RevOps person, you see those bugs come in like, hey, this one thing broke, this little field is no longer appearing, or I'm getting this error when I do this. That's usually due to some kind of stitching. It's running into an error in the communication between two systems. And when something's purpose built to like manage that, there's no stitching, right? It's just one solid piece of fabric. So I think it's you just don't want to buy something in a box because especially if it's mid customer lifecycle. And the main reason for that is that you've got stitching on both sides, right? You've got to
Yeah.
have how the information flows into it and how the information flows back out of it. And so it's kind of a double whammy. You end up with this like, twice as painful experience of trying to make sure the technology and the experience for both the users as well as the customers and then the other departments that you feed into are experiencing. So I think that's one of the things is when you cannot buy a product that is in the box, this is just what it does, and they hand it to you, and then you've got to stitch it all together. It just doesn't work that well.
Yeah. And to that point and to that end, how many times have you lost a customer? And I don't mean like lost a deal. I mean, in your system, had a customer get dropped and have no idea how it happened. How many times does that happen in your career? I know I've seen it happen a number of times at almost every company I've ever worked at.
Like a customer or a prospect?
Like someone who's in the middle of a transition, either from onboarding to CS,
Oh, right.
from any time, or going from closed one to billing, something like that. How many times have you seen that happen?
I have definitely seen it happen, and I can say that it happened more often than I care to admit at one particular company. And it was one of those things where we had a human being that was in charge of stitching that post-close world together. And, there'd be a question, right? A question would arise and they'd say, hey, I need this answer. And then that person didn't respond. And so it just kind of got left. And so getting some visibility and getting more accountability was key. But at the same time, yeah, it happens. And I think that anytime there's a handoff that requires some kind of stitching, whether that technology or human, and technology is preferred over human generally if you can get it dialed in right, but not if it's a point solution. So, yeah.
Yeah, as my grandma used to say, not everybody can be a weaver.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
And
So,
so thinking about this, how do you think we talked a little bit about like early thinking on this, but it's thinking about modern operators, how should they be approaching like streamlining their tech stack? Like what do you think for that end?
I think that the practice I mentioned earlier, where you map your customer life cycle and then you map the technology underneath it, is a really valuable exercise for operations professionals, because it helps you understand the use cases and what the actual workflow is intended to be, and then you can cross compare that with what's actually on the list. Because oftentimes you'll find, just undoing that level of inspection, you'll find that there might be some shelfware right off the bat, and you'll be the hero of everybody if you can find a way to streamline your tech stack with fewer vendors. Your CFO will love you. But you also have to be thinking about each one of those points, right, where technology is talking to another piece of technology. You have to look at those and minimize the number of changes of data, right, and making sure that you have the most streamlined way possible. And then the other part of it is looking into your tech stack and saying, is there functionality that we're not utilizing? Is there a way that this could bridge a gap using the technology? Because it may have been purchased 4 years ago to solve a point solution. But at the same time, is there better options out there of something that was purpose built to solve this problem? So I think it's going back to our CPQ example, it's like you've got to make sure that you have all the upstream people involved, right? Is this something that's going to work for finance? Well, finance obviously cares, and the ones that have to write the check. So, but then also looking at like what happens when you have to renew, like what is the process there, and how do you work with addendums and pieces like that, and looking at that, like that becomes like a really, really big deal to make sure that you have something that spans the whole customer lifecycle. And that's a really good way to approach it, is just to make sure that you're using efficiencies by eliminating the amount of stitching, as well as ensuring that you're utilizing technology. And another piece of really great advice I heard from another RevOps leader recently was NPS scores for your technology. And he was very clear on like, I know what the lowest scoring piece of technology in our tech stack is. And it was pretty funny, but it was still one of those things where he would do a once a year NPS. How do you use it? Do you like it? How crucial is this to your world? And really, they were able to identify some really non-critical systems that they were using by doing that. But basically, like, we don't always ask, like, hey, do you love this tool or do you hate this tool? And I think that's another really, really great practice to make sure that your tech stack is as efficient as possible.
Yeah, and then thinking about that though, it's also there's a lift there, which is it's when you have so many point solutions and so much stitching. Stitching to me, I've been in RevOps and architecting for a long time. That just reads implementation for me. That reads a lot of build time, a lot of consulting work going into it. So, and then like we were talking about CPQ earlier, like massive lift. And so when you think about that, how do you approach that? Because objection handling that is pretty hard because these people are going to be worn out from servicing and managing these solutions. So how do you go about making people feel comfortable with the rip and replace?
So I think part of it is in my experience, most of the time, revenue operations just wants to make people's lives better, right? We want to make things easier for our internal stakeholders. And so I think it's really important to build a use case. And of course, it's really hard to convince someone to rip and replace something. And sometimes that's driven by money, sometimes that's driven by other factors. But when you have a true efficiency to gain, when you say, hey, this is no longer going to be an issue because we're not stitching together these two pieces of technology, I've found that most revenue operations people are game for it, right? Like, hey, we can make it through this implementation. But I also think it's important to talk to that technology provider and get a realistic view of what that implementation will take, and ensure that you get the service that you need. Because sometimes, I'm sure we all have purchased software where they're basically like, thanks for the signature, see you later. And then like you hope that somebody calls you in the next week or so, and then you hope that they actually do what they say they're going to do. And so I think it's important to really investigate and ask those questions, like, what support do you provide? What resources will you need from my team? I think that's a really important aspect to that.
Yeah, that it makes a ton of sense, and it also feeds back into the how are we managing our customers through this life cycle standpoint, where you're saying, I hope someone gets back to me. It's that is it's always, whenever I feel that, I'm like, wait, are we doing that? Is that something we're doing to customers on that side?
So,
Yeah,
ask for a project plan. That's one thing. Like if someone can really tell you like this is what you're going to experience during an implementation, you can go back to your team and say, do you have capacity for this? Can you do this now? If not now, then when? And what does that look like? And being able to use that. I think RevOps is often at the table. And sometimes it's just one of those things where, especially with, back in my early career when people were buying a bunch of point solutions, you were in the room and you were just kind of like, I mean, I guess we can put it in. I'm sure we can. Like we have the capabilities and the knowledge. But as years have gone by, I've learned that no, we need to talk. We need to talk about how this is going to work, because it's not going to be I hang up the phone after the contract is signed and I hope that someone calls me. So, and there's also a lot of downplaying of the customer responsibility in sales cycles sometimes, and saying you will need to do this. Really plainly helps us make better decisions about like, hey, do we want to buy an expanded implementation package if it's something that you pay for? And making sure that you understand that like, hey, they've done this before and they know what they're doing. Let's make sure that they know what capabilities we have in house. I had an implementation not long ago fail because they didn't disclose what it was going to take and really didn't investigate what we needed. And so we ended up with wasn't intended to be a point solution, but we ended up with a point solution that they're going to lose the whole contract because they couldn't bring our systems together like they said they could. So
that is, I mean, that's kind of quintessentially the problem here. And this is awesome. What other things should we be thinking about as we approach this kind of future where everything's horizontal? So we've talked about how it's horizontal. What are some of the ways you think, and I know this is off the cuff, what are some of the ways you think that what are some horizontal solutions that you're actually excited about?
Well, I think that there's more and more, and I think part of it is that you've got to ask the questions. And one example that comes to mind is one recently where our sales outreach tool was something that we were underutilizing, and so when we really looked at it and did an evaluation, we realized it was more horizontal than we thought it was. Another great example, and I'll just be honest, is being able to span the gap between CPQ and our billing systems is pretty. It's pretty amazing. So I think that's something that is pretty powerful. So those would probably be the two most recent examples that I've come across. But I think it's to that end. When you're approaching a renewal 6 months before your renewal, I think it's really important to look and see what else is out there, because there are more and more purpose-built solutions that are meant to span those gaps that have been previously stitched together. And I think it's important to take a step back and really evaluate what you have versus what you could have. So that's something that it's not always easy to do because it's hard to get through the noise every day. Like it's one more thing to do, but usually that efficiency gain is great. And at least you can sleep well at night knowing when your CFO says, are we properly utilizing this tool? You know, yes, you are. We are maximized on how we're using that tool. So
Yeah, and that's a great tie-in to our next webinar, which is on customer lifecycle and mapping, where we're going to be talking a little bit about how to evaluate the needs of your team, how to evaluate the needs of your life cycle, because this is actually going to be an entire series on how are you actually operationalizing your customer journey, which feeds through all the way to what solutions are you buying to how are you setting up your team for success.
mm-hmm. And following that workflow, right? Like
Yeah,
understanding what is the customer experiencing during this, because oftentimes we can focus very internally. So that's I'm excited for the series. So something near and dear
excited.
to my heart.
All right, at this point, we'd love to open up for any questions folks have here. You can navigate to the Q&A tab and ask any questions that you'd want to see answered. While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to see like what are some things you're outside of all of this? What are some things you're really excited about that you're seeing in the RevOps world right now?
I mean, just RevOps. I think the fact that
Yeah,
there's been a nod to the continuous customer lifecycle and the need to have systems and processes and leadership tied between them. I think for a long time it was very much like, hey, the sales ops person just does sales ops problems, and the marketing ops person does marketing ops problems, and the sales ops person. I mean, early in my career, I had before, I guess I was technically RevOps before I knew it, but I had a partner operations, service operations, sales operations, and marketing operations person, and they all operated and did their jobs really well. But having me as that single source of truth was a huge competitive advantage to us. Like when I would sit there and talk directly to our CEO and say, this is the world, right? This is the beginning and the end of the data. And there was no arguing, right? Because we were all the same team. I think that's exciting more than anything else. And also the recognition that revenue operations is a crucial part of a growing SaaS organization. I think it's a crucial part of many organizations, but SaaS especially, that you can't really have a really successful, rapid growth company without a really strong scaffolding built to scale.
yeah,
Because that scaling is difficult, right? Having taken a couple companies from the tens of millions to the $1 billion mark, it's not an easy thing, and the company looks very, very different from the perspective of systems and processes. So you've got to be able to think about, what does it look like 5 years from now, as opposed to what does it look like next week. So yeah.
yeah. I think that's one of the things that I've been seeing that's really interesting is that the fact that now everybody had when I started out, everybody had their 5-year plans. They had their 10-year plans. They talked all about that. But it was when you had marketing question, they were like, no, that this is marketing steal. This is marketing steal. Or you talk to CS and it would be, well, CS didn't really exist then. So there was that.
Yeah.
But it would be like, no, 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 this is all support steal. And now it's everyone realizes, hey, we're a team. We got to tackle this thing together. And I think that is something that's just so exciting, and everybody planning together at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a piece that I've actually wanted to ask you. Um, so, thinking about the, we've talked about point solutions, but there's also team structure, which is like when you think about how the teams have evolved and how we're thinking about everything from MQLs, partner qualified leads, product qualified leads, all of that. Where do you see that going, especially in line with what we're talking about, which is horizontal solutions? Marketing technology plays a big role in that. How are you seeing that evolution happen in your day to
When
day?
you talk about structure, are you talking about like people structure or process structure? What are you talking
Process
about?
structure, more
Process
process,
structure.
process. Yeah.
Yeah, I think again that customer lifecycle map, right? That huge
Yeah.
map that is, and usually it's like this really meaty piece of stuff that you have to do. But really thinking about what is a quality metric and what is a quantity metric that matters in that point. And I
Hmm.
think there's also product. I'm glad you brought product into it because I think that's an important aspect. That there's also got to be a feedback loop into product from the sales organization. So I think overall, you've got to look at the interconnected nature and who needs what data. For example, I'm redoing close lost and close won reasons, right? We're really great at capturing, when we've lost a deal, what that was and why we lost, and if there was a functionality or anything that was missing. But what we haven't gotten very good at is why do we win? Why are people like ultimately making the decision? And so looking at that and saying, we need to create this feedback loop, not just for our sellers, because I can go back to our sellers and say like, hey, you guys need to talk more about this because people are buying us because of this. This is the value they're perceiving. So I think the interconnected nature of like the structure itself is going to continue to get tighter and tighter. So
Yeah. We have an interesting question, which is, how important is it to have a business intelligence layer on top of your tech stack? And how often do you see that you have to gate the data within your company?
okay, so I will say I've had many experiences here, and it just depends on the organization as far as the need to gate information. But I think it business intelligence comes in different forms, right? You've got your BI tools that are out there, your Power BIs, your Tableaus, your Domos, and those are great, but they're also a luxury that a lot of companies can't afford and don't necessarily have the internal resources to build the data lake to be able to manage that, or the people power, right? So I've had the luxury in past worlds to have a data scientist on my team that could dig into it. And so I think it's important, but that business intelligence layer doesn't need to be another tool. Sometimes that business intelligence layer is a frequency that you inspect certain metrics. And that can be done in Excel, that can be done in Salesforce exports, that can be done in any number of ways. But that's where you kind of have to bridge that gap until your company gets to a size and an appropriate amount of revenue to be able to afford a BI tool. But ideally, you'd have a BI tool early on to where you could bring all these systems together, because having that data cohesion is important. But gating data is important because sometimes people can, misinterpret it. So unless you have I'm just going to make up words, like a data mature organization where they know what conversion means, right? And that's one thing I've seen a lot of, like the conversion rate. Conversion rate from what to what? Right, from what to what and what time frame is important. And so when we just talk about a blanket conversion rate, does that mean MQL to SQO? Does that mean MQL to close? What is that actually meaning? And having those definitions very clearly, one, defined within your organization. Like, we will not say conversion rate unless it has the qualifier before it to say this is what conversion rate we're talking about. But then also being disciplined in labeling all of your data. So yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And thank you so much today. That's going to bring us pretty much to the end. So thank you so much for joining today. This was awesome. I'm so excited to do this series with you. Any final thoughts that you want folks to leave with?
No, I think just I'm excited about the series, and it's going to be a fun group to help talk about. So thank you very much, James, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.